Welcome to our channel. We hope you enjoy today's video. Enjoy watching.
My husband didn't touch me on our wedding night, claiming he was too tired and asking me to wait. However, every night, he would sneak down to the basement in silence. When he returned, he would always take a shower to wash off a strange, indescribable smell. I asked him what he was doing down there, and he told me he was exercising. Why would someone exercise at midnight? I couldn't take it anymore, so one night, I decided to follow him to the basement. He chased after me, grabbing my pajamas and yelling at me to go back upstairs. He threatened to divorce me if I went down to the basement. I was furious, clinging to the banister as I trembled with rage. My parents had spent a significant portion of their savings to buy this small villa as our marital home. Why couldn't I enter the basement? Why was my husband speaking to me in such a venomous tone? I took a deep breath to calm myself down. "Jose Manuel, how can you speak to me like that?" I asked. He maintained a firm grip on my pajamas, telling me to go back to our room, where he would explain everything. I pointed to the dark basement, asking why I couldn't go down. Why didn't I have the right? He claimed he had been exercising and stored his valuable equipment down there, but I couldn't see it yet. I tried to move towards the stairs, but he blocked my way. "Why not?" I asked. "Because it's not the right time," he replied. "When the time is right, I'll show you." My stomach sank as I took another deep breath, trying to calm my emotions. He apologized for his harsh words, saying he was a bit worked up and had a sharp tongue, but was a softie at heart. I laughed coldly and went back upstairs. I decided to wait until he left for work the next day to investigate what was going on in the basement. I couldn't sleep, turning from side to side, wondering what secret he was hiding. As I looked at him, it seemed he couldn't sleep either, staring at the ceiling with his eyes wide open. The moonlight illuminated his defined profile, making him look incredibly handsome. His muscular body made him even more attractive. I thought back to when he was courting me, and how I had been so excited. He had told me he liked my kindness and tranquility, as well as my unique presence. I had believed him, but if that were true, why didn't he touch me at night? I raised my hand to caress his face, but he recoiled quickly, looking at me with disgust. He gazed at me as if I were a beggar or a dirty street dog. I turned away, angry, but couldn't swallow my rage. If he didn't have feelings for me, why had he pursued me? Why had he started a relationship with me? I turned back to him, my eyes blazing with anger. He told me he had a psychological problem and was looking for a therapist, asking me to be patient and wait for him. He promised to love me as I deserved after 6 months. He couldn't even touch me with his hands, using his phone instead. Was I that dirty? I had no choice but to wait, sighing silently as I turned away. I had given him everything since we started dating, fulfilling all his desires. He had said he liked watches, so I bought him a luxury watch that cost 6 figures. He had said he liked traveling, so I had accompanied him on trips. He had said he wanted to make money through investments, so I lent him money to learn how to invest. But after we got married, this was what I got in return. I hated the basement. I was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant turning the place upside down. The sun had risen, and I prepared Jose Manuel's favorite breakfast, despite his indifference. He ate in silence, without saying a word to me. It felt like I was his servant, not his wife. After breakfast, I drove him to work, and we both worked in sales at the same perfume company. Once he left, I gave instructions to a colleague before quickly leaving the office. I had a car, but instead of using it, I called a taxi to take me back home. I burst through the front door, rushing towards the basement as fast as I could. But when I opened the door and took my first step down, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was heavy and sticky, and I knew something was off. I turned on the light with trembling hands, and what I saw left me paralyzed for a few seconds. The basement wasn't what I had expected. It was meticulously organized, but in a way that was unsettling. There was a long table in the center, covered with a black cloth that seemed to shine under the dim light. On the table, I saw jars with strange, colored liquids, like something out of a science fiction movie. and next to them, an old balance scale with golden edges. But what really caught my attention was a full-body mannequin dressed in a suit that I recognized. It was my wedding dress. It wasn't a copy, it was the original. I had stored it in a box with my personal belongings, and that box was in our closet. Or so I thought. A shiver ran down my spine as I approached the table to inspect it closer. My hands were sweating so much that I felt like the dress might slip out of my hands if I touched it. But before I could move closer, I heard a soft, rhythmic sound coming from the corner of the basement, a dripping sound. I followed the noise and discovered a small metal bucket on the floor with a dark red liquid dripping from a pipe above. My heart racing, I wondered if it was blood. The smell was strange, a mix of rust and something chemical that made my stomach turn. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise from upstairs, like someone had closed the front door. My heart almost stopped. Jose Manuel had returned, and I felt panic rising from my stomach to my throat. I had to get out of there before he found me. But just as I turned to run towards the stairs, I noticed something else, a black box hidden under the table. It was the same box where I used to store my photos and precious memories. Why was it there? I quickly opened it and found our photos from our dating days, but they were all cut up, with my face removed with surgical precision. Some photos even had burn marks on the edges. The sound of footsteps from upstairs made me realize I had to get out of there fast. I slammed the box shut and ran towards the stairs, but when I reached the last step, the basement door closed abruptly in front of me. "What are you doing down there?" Jose Manuel roared from the other side, his voice cold and almost unrecognizable. Something in his tone sent shivers down my spine. I tried to calm myself down, but my voice trembled. "Jose Manuel, what's going on? Why is my wedding dress here? What does it all mean?" There was a heavy silence before he responded, "Get out of there now." His voice was lower, but laced with a contained threat. My legs refused to move, but fear pushed me to retreat. He opened the door with a force that almost made me lose my balance. His eyes were ablaze, as if an unknown fury was consuming him. "What is all this, Jose Manuel? I'm not going to leave until you explain." He didn't respond immediately, instead grabbing my arm with a force I had never felt before. For a moment, I thought he was going to hurt me, but then he released me abruptly. "If I tell you, you'll regret it," he whispered, almost as if he was talking to himself. "What are you talking about?" My voice came out louder than I expected, echoing in the basement. He turned towards me, and for the first time since I met him, I felt like I wasn't looking at the man I had married. He was someone completely different. "Camila, get out of here. It's your last chance." His tone was definitive, almost desperate. I didn't know what to do but go upstairs and pretend nothing had happened, or stay and demand answers. Then I knew that whatever was happening in that basement would change my life forever. I went upstairs with trembling legs, Jose Manuel following closely behind me like a predator stalking its prey. His breathing was heavy, and I could feel his gaze fixed on my back, making every step unbearable. When we reached the living room, he closed the basement door with force and locked it several times. Then he turned towards me, his face tense. "Listen, Camila, this has an explanation, but I can't tell you everything now." He tried to sound calm, although his hands trembled slightly. I let out a bitter laugh, feeling anger fill my chest. "You think I'll accept that after what I just saw? My wedding dress, destroyed photos, that red liquid?" Jose Manuel's face turned red with rage. "Lower your voice," he growled, bringing his hands to his head as if he was on the verge of a breakdown. I couldn't contain myself anymore. "Explain it to me." I shouted, but instead of responding, he simply collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. His silence was worse than anything he could have said. I stood there, looking at him, trying to decipher what was going on in his mind. Something inside me broke, and I couldn't trust his words, his gestures, or anything he represented. I turned without saying a word and headed to our room. I needed to think, I needed a plan. I closed the door carefully and sat on the bed, looking at the clock on the wall. The hands seemed to be moving slower than ever. Then I remembered the black box. I had left it open downstairs. If Jose Manuel saw it, everything would be lost. But what if he had already found it? My mind began to run with possibilities. A few minutes passed before I heard footsteps approaching the room. My heart accelerated when the door opened slowly, and he entered. "Camila, please, we need to talk," he said, his voice softer this time, almost like a plea. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, crossing my arms. "Not until you tell me what's going on." He sat on the bed, keeping a safe distance, and sighed deeply. For a moment, he seemed defeated. "All this has to do with my past," he said. "There are things I'm not proud of, things I thought would never come to light." "What things?" I asked, although I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He looked up, and for an instant, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before: fear. "Camila, just give me time. I promise everything will be resolved, but you have to trust me." The phrase echoed in my mind like an empty echo. How could he ask me to trust him after everything I had seen? What if I can't? I whispered, feeling tears threaten to spill. He didn't respond, simply getting up and leaving the room, leaving the door ajar. I spent the rest of the day in a state of constant tension, trying to act normally while my mind worked on how to get back to the basement. I had to retrieve the box or at least make sure he hadn't moved it. When night finally arrived, I heard him go up the stairs and enter the bathroom. It was my opportunity. I snuck back to the same spot where I had left the box, took it with care, and opened it, hoping to find something that would explain the chaos. But what I saw left me breathless. Among the destroyed photos, there was something I hadn't noticed before: a small envelope with my name written in red ink. My hands trembled as I opened it, and inside, I found a note that said, "If you've made it this far, it means you don't trust me. But be careful, Camila. Some truths are too dangerous to be discovered." I felt like the blood had drained from my face. It was a threat, a warning. Before I could react, I heard the basement door open behind me. "What are you doing here?" Jose Manuel's voice was cold, filled with contained anger that made me turn around sharply. I held the box against my chest like a shield. "What does this mean?" I asked, showing him the note with a trembling hand. His eyes fixed on the envelope, and his expression changed completely. For a moment, he seemed genuinely scared. "Camila, this shouldn't have happened," he murmured, taking a step towards me. I retreated, feeling panic take over. "Don't come any closer," I warned, my voice breaking. "Listen, you have to give me that box. You don't understand what you're doing." But I couldn't listen to his excuses anymore. I had come too far to turn back now. As I held the box against my chest, I felt like every beat of my heart resonated in my ears, deafening. Jose Manuel took another step towards me, but his movements were slow, calculated, as if he feared that any misstep could trigger something worse. "Camila, please give me the box," he said with a tone so low I could barely hear him. But his eyes spoke of desperation. I couldn't give in, not after what I had found. "I won't give it to you," I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. "I'm tired of your lies, Jose Manuel. I want the truth, and I want it now." He brought his hands to his head, seemingly torn between two invisible forces. Finally, he sighed deeply and let his shoulders drop, as if the weight of the world rested on them. "Fine," he said with a broken voice. "If you want the truth, then be prepared. But I swear, after this, you'll never look at me the same way again." His words chilled me to the bone. Part of me wanted to drop the box and run, but it was too late to turn back now. I remained still as he sat on the edge of the basement table, looking at me with a mix of resignation and sadness. "It all started years ago, long before I met you," he began. "It started with me staring at a point on the floor. I did things I'm not proud of, things I'm still paying for." "What things?" I interrupted, feeling anxiety build up in my chest. He looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before: guilt. I was young and ambitious, working for a company that didn't hesitate to play dirty to get what they wanted. At first, I thought it was just work, that nothing I did was really bad. But then. He paused, and I felt the room start to spin. His words were vague, but the tone in which he spoke made me imagine things I didn't want to contemplate. "What did you do?" I asked, almost in a whisper. I was assigned projects, experiments involving chemicals and materials that shouldn't be in the wrong hands. I thought it was just work, that none of it had real consequences. But I was wrong. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, feeling a sense of unease. Invisibles looked at me, and for the first time since I met him, he seemed completely disarmed. "Everything you see down here is an attempt to fix my mistakes. Each sentence, each object is part of something that shouldn't have existed." I felt a surge of anger and shouted, "What is all this?" José Manuel closed his eyes, as if the question pained him more than he was willing to admit. "I'll explain everything later, but I promise it has nothing to do with you, at least not directly." I repeated, incredulous, "Not directly?" Before he could respond, the basement light flickered and then went out completely. A metallic noise echoed from the darkest corner of the room, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. José Manuel jumped up, as if the sound had put him on high alert. "We need to get out of here, now," he said with an urgency I had never seen before. I insisted, "What's going on?" but he didn't respond. Instead, he snatched the box from my hands and threw it onto the table, where it landed with a loud thud. "You can't keep getting involved in this, Camila," he shouted with a fury that left me paralyzed. "This isn't a game." But before I could react, something else happened. The basement door, which I thought was closed, creaked open slowly, and we both stood in silence, staring at the door as if something was about to cross it. José Manuel started to say something, but I interrupted him. "What's going on?" I asked again, feeling a sense of dread. He didn't respond, instead telling me to go upstairs immediately. I felt my body move on instinct, and I ran up the stairs as fast as I could. But when I reached the top step, I turned around to look at him. He was still in the basement, his fists clenched and his gaze fixed on the open door. "José Manuel, come with me," I said, but he didn't move. In that moment, I knew something terrible was happening, something that went beyond what I could understand. When I finally reached the living room, I closed the basement door behind me and collapsed onto the sofa, trying to calm my breathing. But then I heard it, a blood-curdling scream that came from downstairs. The scream resonated throughout the house, as if the walls themselves vibrated with its echo. I was paralyzed on the sofa, unable to move, as my mind struggled to process what I had just heard. It was José Manuel's voice, but there was something inhuman about it, as if the pain he expressed didn't belong to this world. My first reaction was to get up, but my legs wouldn't respond. I looked towards the basement door, now closed, and felt a surge of pure terror. What was happening down there? What was happening to José Manuel? I finally gathered the courage to approach the door, my heart racing so fast I thought it would jump out of my chest. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened intently. The silence that followed the scream was even more terrifying. "José Manuel," I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response, no sound, no movement. The air around me felt heavier, almost suffocating. In that moment, my instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the house and find help. But something else, perhaps guilt or the need to know the truth, kept me there. I looked around the room, searching for something to use to protect myself, and found an old iron candelabra. I held it tightly as I opened the basement door. The darkness seemed denser than before, as if it was inviting me to enter. I descended the stairs slowly, the candelabra trembling in my hands. "José Manuel, please tell me you're okay," my voice cracked at the end of the sentence. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped, frozen by the scene before me. The candelabra slipped from my hands and fell to the ground with a metallic clang. José Manuel was on his knees in the center of the room, his head tilted back and his arms extended. There were symbols etched into the floor around him, drawn with what appeared to be the red liquid from the cube I had seen earlier. But the most terrifying thing was the figure behind him, a tall, amorphous shadow looming over José Manuel like it was enveloping him. It had no face, but its contours seemed to vibrate like it was made of smoke and electricity at the same time. I felt the air being sucked out of me, as if the presence of this thing was draining all the oxygen from the room. "Jose Manuel," I screamed, taking a step towards him. He slowly raised his head, and what I saw made me recoil. His eyes, normally warm and brown, were now completely black, like two bottomless pits. "You shouldn't have come down here, Camila," he said, but his voice wasn't his own, it was deeper, almost guttural, like another entity was speaking through him. I tried to run towards the stairs, but I tripped over the fallen candelabra and fell to the ground. The figure behind Jose Manuel seemed to move, extending what appeared to be arms towards me. "Camila, don't move," Jose Manuel shouted, his voice normal but filled with panic. "Don't let it touch you." I remained frozen, too terrified to even breathe. The figure stopped just inches from me, and I felt a cold so intense I thought my skin would freeze. Jose Manuel took advantage of the moment to stand up and position himself between the figure and me. "Leave her alone," he shouted with a strength I didn't know he had. The figure seemed to recoil, as if Jose Manuel's words had some kind of power over it. But then, with a quick movement, it vanished into the darkness of the basement. The silence returned, but this time it was not a relief. Jose Manuel turned towards me, his face covered in sweat and his body trembling. "You have to leave, Camila, now," he said. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, "What was that?" He didn't respond immediately, instead taking me by the shoulders and looking me in the eye with an intensity one had never seen before. "Please, don't ask any more questions. Just trust me this time." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in his gaze stopped me. I nodded slowly, and together we went up the stairs, leaving behind the basement and everything it contained. When we reached the living room, he closed the door and stood in front of it, as if guarding something. "Jose Manuel, I can't live like this. I need to know what's going on," I said. He sighed, and for a moment I thought he was going to tell me the truth, but instead he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "I need help, it's urgent," he said into the phone. I stood there in silence, watching him as he spoke in a low voice. I didn't know who he was talking to or what he was planning, but one thing was certain, this was far from over. Jose Manuel ended the call and put his phone away without saying a word. His hands were shaking slightly, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely scared. I stared at him, waiting for some explanation, but the silence between us was so thick it seemed impossible to break. "Who did you call?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He avoided my gaze, keeping his eyes fixed on the basement door. "Someone who can help us," he replied in a tone so cold it sent shivers down my spine. "Help us?" I repeated, my voice rising. "I don't even know what's going on. How is someone else supposed to help if I don't have a clue what's happening?" Jose Manuel turned to me, his face a mixture of frustration and desperation. "Camila, I can't explain it to you right now. Just trust me, okay?" I laughed bitterly, crossing my arms. "Trust you? After everything I've seen, the dress, the photos, that thing in the basement, and you're asking me to trust you?" He stepped closer, his hands on my shoulders, but I pulled away. "I know all this is crazy, but I swear I'm trying to protect you," he said. "Protect me from what?" I shouted, pulling away from his grasp. "Tell me, Jose Manuel." He took a deep breath, as if shouldering a weight too heavy to bear alone. Finally, he looked up and said something that I would never forget. Those two words hung in the air, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I felt like the ground beneath my feet was crumbling, like everything I thought I knew about him was disappearing in a matter of seconds. "What do you mean?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he started pacing back and forth, as if wrestling with himself. Finally, he stopped and looked at me with an intensity that left me breathless. "There are things about me, about my past, that I've tried to keep hidden. Not because I wanted to deceive you, but because I didn't know how to face them." "What things?" I pressed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Before he could say anything more, the doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. We both froze, looking towards the entrance as if waiting for something or someone to come in at any moment. "It's him," Jose Manuel said in a low voice, walking towards the door. "Who?" I asked, following him. Jose Manuel opened the door to reveal a tall man with gray hair, impeccably dressed in a suit. He had an air of authority that made me feel small. But what caught my attention most were his piercing blue eyes, which seemed to see right through me. "Good evening," the man said in a deep, calm voice. "I'm Dr. Eduardo Mendez. Jose Manuel called me to help with the situation." "What situation?" I asked, crossing my arms. Dr. Mendez looked at me with a faint smile, but there was something in his expression that didn't reassure me at all. "I understand this must all be very confusing for you, but I assure you I'm here to make sure everything is under control." "Under control?" I repeated, taking a step forward. "And how do you plan to do that, doctor?" Dr. Mendez didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Jose Manuel and nodded, as if they understood each other without needing words. "I need access to the basement," Dr. Mendez said finally, pulling out a black briefcase. My instincts screamed at me to stop him, to prevent him from going down there. But before I could say anything, Jose Manuel had already opened the basement door and gestured for Dr. Mendez to go down. "Camila, stay here," Jose Manuel said, but I wasn't about to obey. "I'm coming with you," I said, following them down to the basement. Dr. Mendez turned on a powerful flashlight and began to inspect every corner, muttering things I didn't understand. Finally, he stopped in front of the symbols on the floor and pulled out a small vial from his briefcase. He poured a clear liquid over the symbols, which immediately began to disappear as if they had never been there. "This is worse than I thought," Dr. Mendez murmured, looking at Jose Manuel. "You shouldn't have tried to handle this alone." Jose Manuel clenched his fists. I had no choice. I demanded, "Someone is going to explain what's going on here. My patience is at an end." Dr. Mendez looked at me and sighed. "What I'm about to tell you may seem incredible, but I assure you it's the truth." He took a chair that was next to the basement table and sat down calmly, as if what he was about to say required all his concentration. His imposing presence filled the space, but it didn't calm my anxiety. Jose Manuel stood with his arms crossed, avoiding my gaze. "Dr. Mendez began to speak years ago. Before Jose Manuel met you, he worked on a confidential project funded by an organization whose name I'm not at liberty to disclose. This project involved creating chemical compounds designed to manipulate human emotions." I felt like I was running out of air. I didn't know what was more disturbing, the words Dr. Mendez was saying or the way Jose Manuel was still avoiding my gaze. "Manipulate emotions?" I asked, trying to process what I was hearing. "Yes, the idea was to develop a formula that could intensify feelings like happiness, calmness, or even fear," Dr. Mendez continued. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. Dr. Mendez leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Everything, because Jose Manuel didn't leave that project behind like he should have. One of those formulas is here in this house, and it's been affecting both of you since the day you moved in." "That's ridiculous," I exclaimed, looking at Jose Manuel. "You knew all about this and didn't tell me?" Jose Manuel finally looked up, and in his gaze, I saw a mix of guilt and desperation. "Camila, I didn't know things would go this far. I thought I could control it. I thought I could protect you." Dr. Mendez intervened, raising his hand to calm me down. "The consequences of those formulas, you see, Mrs. They not only manipulate emotions, they can also attract things." "Things," I repeated, feeling a chill run down my spine. "Entities," Dr. Mendez said, his voice low and serious. "What has this to do with my dress, the photos?" I asked, unable to hide the anguish in my voice. Jose Manuel took a step towards me, but didn't try to touch me. "The entity takes what's important to us. It's its way of connecting with this world." I felt like my head was spinning. Everything I was hearing seemed like it was from a nightmare, but at the same time, it fit with what I had experienced. What do we do now? How do we stop this? Dr. Mendez stood up and opened his briefcase, pulling out several vials and strange tools. First, we need to neutralize the formula that's in this house. Then, we need to seal the entity's access to this place. But I need your help, Mrs. Camila. My help? I asked, confused. The entity is linked to you as much as it is to Jose Manuel. To seal it, we need something that's important to you, something that represents your connection to this place. I thought for a moment, and then I knew. My wedding dress, I said, feeling a lump in my throat. Dr. Mendez nodded as if he had expected it. I need you to bring it here. I ran upstairs to the room where I had originally stored the dress, but it was no longer there. I returned to the basement, my heart racing. It's not there, I said, almost breathless. Jose Manuel pointed to a corner of the basement where the dress was hanging, completely intact. It was as if it had been waiting for this moment. Dr. Mendez began to prepare a circle on the floor using salt and other materials I didn't recognize. When everything was ready, we placed the dress in the center. Now, I need you both to stay outside the circle and not interfere, no matter what happens, Dr. Mendez said, his voice serious. What happened next was something I would never forget. Dr. Mendez poured a liquid over the dress, and it began to burn without fire, as if it was disintegrating into the air. The room filled with a cold wind, and the dark figure appeared again, moving erratically. Jose Manuel held me tight, whispering for me not to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure tried to cross the circle, but each time it did, it retreated with a growl that sent shivers down my spine. Finally, with one last screech, it disappeared completely. The basement fell silent. Dr. Mendez stood up, visibly exhausted, and looked at us. It's done. But remember, this can't be repeated. If anything remains here, if there are any residues of the formula, they could attract it again. I turned to Jose Manuel, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I knew that this would change our relationship forever. After that night, the house never felt the same again. Dr. Mendez left us with strict instructions to clean any remaining traces of the formulas. We spent days reviewing every corner, discarding vials, burning papers, and reorganizing our lives. Jose Manuel tried to explain more about his past, but something inside me could no longer see him in the same way. I loved him, yes, but the man I thought I knew had been an illusion. Still, we both decided to try to heal, to rebuild our relationship from the ashes. We put the house up for sale and moved to a small apartment, far from everything, far from the dark memories that still haunted me. Jose Manuel started therapy, and I did too. I knew the road wouldn't be easy, but I was willing to try. The most important thing was to leave the past behind, even though the scars would always be there. Sometimes, at night, I still have nightmares about that dark figure, about the cold I felt in the basement. But every time I wake up, I remind myself that I survived, that I faced my fears and came out stronger. This is my story, and I share it here not only to release everything I've been carrying inside, but also to warn you, never ignore the signs. If something in your life seems strange, if you feel that something is not right, trust your instincts. It may save your life, just like it did mine.